Hi, everybody.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for coming, and I'm sorry I couldn't be there.
David,
In
please can you lower the microphone a little bit that the voice is stronger? Lower, lower, put it lower. Yes, that, yeah,
Okay, how about that now?
perfect.
Great. This is work that Ling Tan and I started. She was a visiting scientist with us at the Center for Crisis Studies in Mitigation at the University of Manchester. And this collaboration started, she arrived during the pandemic year. And I'm sure we've all seen articles about how heat or precipitation or humidity or wind speed has affected the spread of the COVID pandemic. And if you're like me, you may have been curious, you may have looked at some of them, and you may have even seen contradictory results from among these various studies. And so I think what I want to do is illustrate kind of some of the situation, the situation with this quality of the literature by looking at this one study. This was one of the earliest studies that was published, Tosepu et al. In April 2020. And this is the key figure from their paper. And they say in the text, this figure shows that the COVID spread that occurred in Jakarta experienced a rapid increase. And I'm sure you can see several problems with this. And I ended up writing a comment on this paper to the journal. The first issue was how many days were in this study. One graph shows 11, the other shows 29. You also notice that there were several zeros during the course of February 2020 in Jakarta, Indonesia. This seemed um, quite unusual, if not record breaking, and there was no explanation in the paper for that. And then, of course, the third problem with this was the increase in COVID cases, and clearly that graph does not show that. Now, in their response, the authors said that they only had 11 days, but for whatever reason, they felt like showing the weather throughout the entire month, and that the data came from the meteorological department in Indonesia, and that's fine. No explanation from them related to the inclusion of the zero values. It was not. We could not say whether it was correct or not. We just used the data as it was, and so it was. And this is by far one of the most unusual cases there. But I think what's most surprising is that this was a highly cited paper. Within a year after publishing it, Web of Science indicated it was a hot paper. It was highly cited. It was cited 138 times. And by August, well, just last week when I was looking up the data, there were over 1,000 citations to this paper. Now, if that's not enough, you'll also notice that this article was accepted on the same day it was received by the chief editor of the journal, and it was available online 2 days later. Okay, so this started raising a bunch of questions and whether we could look at the literature as a whole to try and understand not only more about the relationship between weather and COVID, but also what was going on in the publication process during this time. And so I want to focus on specifically the challenges that people who do this kind of research face, and when we get to the end of this talk, make some recommendations. Now, we pursued two complementary approaches to the literature. One was to do a meta-regression analysis of 158 articles that had quantitative information in there about the relationship between COVID and different weather variables. And the second one was a systematic review of nearly 300 peer-reviewed journal articles, and both of these studies have been published. So let's start with the meta-regression analysis. Within these 158 peer-reviewed journal articles, we found over 4,000, nearly 5,000 correlation coefficients that calculated the weather, calculated relationships between different weather variables and either COVID cases or COVID deaths. I think one of the most surprising things about looking at these studies in this way was that half of them did not report a time lag between the date that the COVID cases was recorded and when that date of infection occurred. Now, of course, we don't necessarily know when these people were infected, but you do need to assume some kind of time lag between these two dates. And the fact that half of the studies didn't do that meant that for that half of this, for those half of the studies, that they were looking on the weather, that they were looking at the relationship between COVID and well, the weather on the day that the COVID case was recorded in the database. And of course, that's not really what we're after here. So half of the studies were flawed in this manner. And if you look at take our data set and break it up into those studies where time lag was recorded, those are the figure on the left side, and compare that to the ones where there was no time lag. So these are the ones that would not make any physical sense. And what you're seeing here are the correlation coefficients for the different variables for each of the variables. And if they're blue, they indicate a negative relationship between the weather variable and COVID cases or deaths. And also the red indicates a positive correlation. And so by looking at the whole data set as a whole and synthesizing this, you can look for relationships. And what you can see is that if you include the time lag, you get drastically different results. You see, the more of the studies without the time lag have positive correlations, whereas if you include the time lag correctly, then you get a negative correlation with temperature and pressure, humidity, and dew point temperature were also other variables here that indicated this flip of depending on whether you included a time lag or not. Now let's go on to the systematic review. We looked at the 2-year period, 2020 and 2021, and looked at, like I said, nearly 300 peer-reviewed journal articles. In the article, our work was guided by 4 questions. I'm only going to present 3 of them here. And the first question, or number 2 in the paper, is, are the data collected and the statistical methods within the publications able to support the view that there was a relationship between the transmission of COVID and the weather? And in this larger framework of studies, of the 260 studies where it was appropriate to their research method that they include a time lag, here we found again not 50%, but 42% that did not report a time lag again. Another issue with the data or the choice of the analysis approach um, is when the data was collected relative to what was going on with the number of COVID cases. And here you can see in these boxes that represents a period of duration of the individual studies, and the various studies go up the y-axis there. So there's a number of studies here in China. And you can see during this time period, along the x-axis is the cumulative number of cases in China during this time. And most of the studies um, that are looking at weather and COVID are looking at it during this period of rapid growth. And it's kind of hard to imagine that um, that you would be able to tease out the subtle effects of weather on COVID during this rapid expansion, where population level interactions in the spread of the disease is much worse, is much more important. The third question that we asked was whether the peer review process was rigorous enough to eliminate obvious flaws in the manuscript, and if it wasn't, what ways would it need to be improved? And we saw from the Tosepu et al. Study that there was no peer review. The paper was accepted on the day that uh, it was received at the journal. And here you can see the distribution both in 2020 and 2021 of the number of days that these individual studies um, took in the peer review process. And specifically, 21 articles of this data set took 10 days or less. And I'm sure we would all like our papers to spend less than 10 days in the peer review process. But on the other hand, is this an adequate enough time to uh, to have the article fully vetted? Now, if we look at the top 12 articles here, they all took place. They all had peer reviews that lasted less than a week. And you can see Tosepu et al. Is one of three papers that were accepted on the same day that they were received. Surprisingly, or perhaps not so surprisingly, all of these articles appeared in the same journal, and they were all, except one, and rather highly cited, hundreds of citations. Sorry, let me get me out of the way there. As of June 2022, when we did this study. Now, of course, peer review isn't the only way that you can evaluate the quality of articles and evaluate them. There's also post-publication review, and so you could have a comment reply exchange like I did with the Tosepu et al. One. You could point out the flaws in later publications that followed, point out the flaws of these earlier studies. Authors who recognize that there are problems with the study could submit corrigenda or errata and update their paper, or if it's bad enough, fatal enough flaws, they could be retracted. So of this data set, were any of these subject to these various things? Now, of all these nearly 300 papers, we were able to find only one comment reply exchange, and that was the one that I had with Tosepu et al. Now, in terms of critical citations, it's pretty obvious when you read these other papers that they're not critiquing the articles upon which they are citing. And as one example, I looked at all 272 citations from that Web of Science recorded at this one particular time about Tosepu et al. And only one of these 272 citations mentioned that this paper had a particular flaw or flaws. Now, authors weren't correcting their own work either. There was only one corrigenda that we were able to find, and that was just correcting the base map of some contested territories in India. In terms of retractions, we found one study that was was retracted forcibly by the journal when someone raised a comment about the author using improper statistical methods, but the author rebutted this and said I actually wasn't using these methods, but the journal still retracted the paper anyway. So post-publication review didn't seem to be too successful in this regard either. And then finally, we asked the question, are there best practices that we've learned from looking at the quality, looking at the comments of these various studies. And we have a much broader, much longer list in the paper that you can look at, but here we can just see a few of them. Avoid trying to ascertain any of whether COVID relationships during these rapid growth phases. That's not going to be too successful. Avoid calculating things over short time periods where the fluctuation in weather conditions would be really small. Indeed, we found one paper had as few as 7 days that went into their study, and the Tosepu et al. Had 11 days in the data. Number three is account for the time lag. Again, that's something that we've been pointing out in many of these studies, and 40 to 50% of these studies have this problem. There's no need to assume linearity between the weather variables and the cases. Nonlinear methods can be equally, if not better, suited for the relationship between weather and COVID variables. The choice of humidity variable is important. It's important to think about and understand the difference for between relative humidity and absolute humidity, mixing ratio, dew point temperature. Um, Probably don't have to mention that to people in this audience who may be familiar with meteorology, but so many of these studies were done by non-meteorologists who may not recognize the difference between these different humidity variables and their interpretation. And then finally, air quality also affects the spread of COVID. There's a few studies that have looked at that, but few that have integrated the weather and air quality in it. As far as I'm aware, there's opportunities to look at that in the future as well. Anyway, there's a QR code where you can download the second study that we talked about there. Anyway, thanks for your time. Thanks for listening, and I'll turn it back over to Tanya.